a courtroom, a kick, and the moment a 15-year-old boy's stare exposed a system built on fear, not justice. What started as a simple hearing in Briarfield became a national reckoning, uncovering lies, buried cases, and a judge who refused to flinch. If you think one person can't change the system, think again. Watch till the end. Like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak truth louder than silence. It happened in less than 3 seconds. No one moved at first. Not the clerk, not the bailiff, not even the rows of silent spectators pressed into the back pews of Briarfield Superior Courtroom Number 3. A kick had just cracked through the still air like a gunshot, and for a moment, time stood suspended in the stunned aftermath. What made this moment unforgettable wasn't just the sound, or the audacity, or even the disbelief that followed. It was who delivered it. Ethan Lorne, a white corrections officer with 22 years of unshaken confidence in his badge, and who received it. Judge Benton, a black man, 71 years old, with a record of rulings as unflinching as his gaze. It wasn't just a strike, it was an indictment of everything this courtroom had let slide for far too long. The morning had begun like any other Monday in Briarfield. The courthouse, a gray-bricked government building tucked between a shuttered textile warehouse and a gas station with flickering fluorescent lights, stirred to life around 8 o'clock. The docket was full, the coffee burnt, and the security line as slow as ever. But no one, not the lawyers, not the press, not the tired families with folded subpoenas in hand, expected what would unfold before the first recess. The hearing was for a simple misconduct charge. At least, that's what the files said. A teenager named Deshaun Ellis had been accused of resisting arrest, though what he had actually done was make the mistake of locking eyes with an officer during a late-night patrol. His mother, sitting silently on the third bench, clutched her purse and stared straight ahead. Her son sat hunched in a button-down that hung off his shoulders like it had belonged to his older cousin. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just waited, as if he already knew what the outcome would be. Judge Benton had presided over cases like this for decades. Too many, in fact. His courtroom demeanor was legendary. He never raised his voice. He never rushed. But there was something else about him that demanded respect. He saw. Not just the charges or the paperwork or the uniforms. He saw what people carried into the courtroom with them. Fear, anger, shame, hope. He had once told a group of law students that justice doesn't live in a robe. It lives in what you refuse to ignore. That morning, he wasn't just watching a case. He was watching a moment build into something bigger than itself. When Officer Ethan Lorne took the stand, the shift was immediate. He didn't look at Deshaun. He didn't acknowledge the mother. He walked with the kind of weight that years of unchecked power gave a man. Each step louder than the last, his shoulders too square, his boots too polished. His uniform bore no creases, but his words did. Bent around phrases like non-verbal defiance, reflex training, and compliance hesitation. He said he felt threatened by the boy's posture, by his refusal to look down. He said it was standard procedure. He said he feared for his safety. Judge Benton, hands folded neatly, leaned in slightly and asked a single question. "You felt threatened? By a 15-year-old in a white hoodie standing still?" That was the moment the room turned. Something shifted in Lorne's face. Not confusion, not shame, but insult, as if the question itself was an attack. He stood, without permission, and raised his voice. He accused the judge of bias, of undermining law enforcement, of coddling these people. And then, in a flash of rage, he leaned forward and struck Benton across the face. A full-grown man, a state officer, striking a judge in open court. Gasps burst from every corner of the room. Someone dropped a pen. A woman in the back began to sob. One of the public defenders reached instinctively for her phone, but fumbled it to the ground. The bailiff hesitated, momentarily frozen by the rank of the man who had just committed the assault. But Benton didn't flinch. He didn't raise a hand to his cheek. He didn't blink. He simply looked at Lorne, not with anger, but with something far colder. Recognition. That kick wasn't just an act of violence, it was a confession of entitlement, of impunity, of a system that had grown so arrogant it believed it could strike the very symbol of its own restraint and walk away untouched. But not this time. Not in Benton's court. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. Lorne stood there, breathing heavily, as if daring the courtroom to react. And slowly, methodically, Judge Benton reached for his gavel. Not to silence the court, but to bring it to order. "Officer Lorne," he said, voice steady as stone, "you are now in contempt of this court, and under immediate review for assault, obstruction, and judicial interference. Remove him." That single command did more than place Lorne in cuffs. It pierced the illusion that power made a man untouchable. It signaled something that had not been heard in a long time in that courtroom: accountability. As Lorne was escorted out, his boots no longer thunderous, but scuffing nervously against the floor, eyes turned back to Judge Benton. His cheek reddened, his posture unshaken. He simply nodded once and said, "Let's proceed." The ripple was instant. Phones buzzed with headlines. Journalists rushed to write the first drafts. But for those in the courtroom, what lingered wasn't the kick itself. It was Benton's refusal to flinch. The refusal to return force with force. His silence wasn't weakness. It was judgment. Outside, protesters began gathering before the end of the lunch break. Within 4 hours, a crowd of nearly 500 filled the courthouse steps, chanting, holding signs, playing back the footage captured on a single witness's phone. In less than 1 day, the story had spread across the state, and the phrase, "the kick that woke the South," began trending. But Benton never commented. He didn't hold a press conference or deliver an emotional speech. He simply returned to chambers, reviewed the rest of the docket, and prepared for the next case. Because for him, this wasn't just about what had happened in those 3 seconds. It was about everything that had led up to it, and everything that needed to come after. And now, so do you. This is just the beginning of a story that reveals how one courtroom, one act of arrogance, and one unshaken judge exposed the machinery behind decades of abuse. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it, because this story isn't over. And justice doesn't end in silence. It begins when someone refuses to look away. They said it was defiance. They said it was resistance. But when the courtroom lights burned overhead and all eyes turned to the grainy surveillance stills from that night, what everyone saw was a 15-year-old boy standing still, hands at his sides, shoulders tense, and eyes locked with the officer who would later call him a threat. His name was Deshaun Ellis, and though he barely took up space on the courtroom bench, his presence forced an entire legal system to confront the truth it had long buried. The day after Officer Ethan Lorne kicked Judge Isaiah Benton in open court, the atmosphere at Briarfield Superior was transformed. Reporters packed the gallery. Legal interns, who normally slipped in and out unnoticed, now took detailed notes. Something had shifted. Not just the air, but the stakes. Everyone now understood that the hearing they dismissed as minor, a juvenile resisting arrest case, was the spark threatening to burn the veil off an entire system. Deshaun sat in the defendant's seat, legs too short to comfortably touch the floor, fingers folded tight in his lap. His shirt, white, collared, clearly ironed by someone who cared, was 2 sizes too large. He didn't look like someone ready to fight the system. He looked like someone trying to survive it. But in that survival, in his silence, he carried the weight of generations who had been told to watch their tone, lower their eyes, stay small. The incident had taken place just after 8:30 in the evening, near a corner store in South Briarfield. The security footage, shaky and half obscured by fogged glass, showed Deshawn stepping out of the store, pulling out a receipt from his pocket, and pausing under a street lamp. Officer Lorne's cruiser pulled up slowly, almost casually. He didn't exit the vehicle right away. Instead, he waited. Then, after 30 seconds, he stepped out, called out something inaudible, and approached. When Deshawn didn't immediately look away, Lorne's posture changed. The footage, paused on screen in the courtroom, showed the boy lifting his chin slightly, not in challenge, but in habit, in pride, in instinct. That small motion, a barely perceptible rise of the neck, would later be described in the police report as nonverbal escalation, a phrase Benton underlined twice in his copy of the case file. Lorne had claimed he felt at risk of sudden attack and moved to initiate a stop and frisk. According to his report, Deshawn resisted the search by remaining unresponsive and motionless. No raised fists, no backpedal, just stillness. Judge Benton listened to the testimony with the same calm that had followed the kick. His cheeks and torso still bore faint discolorations, though he wore it like a badge rather than a bruise. As the prosecutor asked questions, Benton's gaze never left Deshawn. He watched the boy's fingers twitch, his shoulders tighten every time the words non-compliant or aggressive posture were mentioned. Then came Deshawn's turn to speak. He stood slowly, reluctantly, and approached the stand like it was a ledge. The microphone wobbled slightly as he adjusted it. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, almost in a whisper, "I didn't move, because I didn't know what would make it worse." The courtroom didn't breathe. Benton leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Deshawn looked up, not at the judge, but at the ceiling, as if searching for the exact words. "If I ran, he'd chase me. If I talked back, he'd say I was threatening. If I reached in my pocket, he might shoot. If I did nothing, maybe he'd walk away." He paused, then added with crushing simplicity, "But he didn't." Somewhere in the gallery, a woman exhaled too loudly. A man clenched the arms of his seat, and for the first time, it became painfully clear. Deshawn had not been resisting. He had been calculating his odds of survival. Naomi Chen, the journalist who had been following the case, later wrote in her column that this wasn't a trial, it was a diagnosis. A child had been placed under a microscope, and what was exposed was not criminality, but trauma, fear coded into muscle memory, the reflex of stillness as self-defense. Benton ordered the footage replayed. This time he instructed the clerk to slow it to half speed. Frame by frame, the courtroom watched Officer Lorne place a heavy hand on Deshawn's shoulder, spin him, and force him to the ground. There was no struggle, no resistance, only the quiet collapse of a boy trying not to die on a sidewalk. The state's legal counsel tried to pivot. They cited protocol, field training, rising neighborhood crime statistics. But the more they spoke, the hollower their defense sounded. Benton interrupted only once, his voice like gravel. "Are we now criminalizing the absence of movement?" It was more than a rhetorical question. It was a fracture line. And through it, the truth began to pour. As the trial continued, more details emerged. Deshawn was an honor student. His math teacher had written a letter describing him as gentle, meticulous, and often too quiet for his own good. He volunteered on weekends. He helped his younger sister with her spelling homework every night. None of it mattered to the arrest report, but it mattered to everyone watching. The crowd outside the courthouse doubled over the next 48 hours. Civil rights attorneys flew in. Community leaders organized vigils. Students from Deshawn's school held a walkout, marching silently with signs that read, "Stillness is not a crime." Inside the courtroom, Judge Benton quietly requested additional records, not just from this case, but from the arresting officer's last 10 juvenile encounters. What he found wasn't surprising, but it was damning. 8 out of 10 boys arrested were Black or Latino. 7 were charged with vague offenses like suspicious behavior or refusal to cooperate. In each case, there were no weapons, no drugs, just presence, just posture. By the end of the week, the courtroom was no longer just a stage for a single boy's case. It had become a mirror, one that reflected every child who had been taught that the wrong glance could cost them their life. And yet, through it all, Deshawn remained quiet, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was that very whisper that cut through the courtroom like a bell. Not because it was loud, but because it carried truth. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't beg, doesn't threaten. It simply refuses to vanish. Judge Benton, after reviewing all available evidence, dismissed the charges and filed a formal misconduct complaint against Ethan Lorne's unit. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He simply said, "This court does not accept fear as evidence." The words made headlines, but for Deshawn Ellis, they meant something more. They meant he was seen, not just as a defendant, not just as a body in a hoodie, but as a boy who dared to stand still in a world that told him to shrink. And sometimes, standing still is the loudest thing a person can do. The courtroom no longer belonged to the state, not in the way it used to. Not after Deshawn Ellis stood on that witness stand, 15 years old, barely over 5 feet tall, and explained how stillness had become his only form of survival. Something had shifted, not just in the eyes of the public, but in the posture of the court itself. So when Officer Ethan Lorne took the stand 3 days later, flanked by legal counsel, his uniform crisp and shoulders squared as always, he was no longer the unshakable authority figure people had once feared. He was the accused, whether officially or not. And the silence that followed his entry into the courtroom was not respect. It was scrutiny. He sat tall, 6'3", a jaw carved sharp by years of command. His state-issued badge gleamed in the light, polished like a mirror he didn't seem interested in looking into. His boots, heavy and deliberate, echoed in the same rhythm he had used when he approached Deshawn on the street that night. A rhythm meant to establish dominance, to make others feel smaller. But today, the only one shrinking was the illusion of his infallibility. The prosecution began with protocol. "Officer Lorne," the attorney said, measured and polite, "walk us through the moment you made contact with the subject." "Standard field interaction," he replied. His voice was even, trained. Suspect displayed non-compliant posture, refused to follow verbal instructions, and exhibited what we classify as pre-resistance behavior. I engaged using a calibrated takedown maneuver. He said it like it was science, as if every movement had been pulled from a manual, as if Deshawn Ellis were a simulation, not a child. The term pre-resistance behavior was spoken without a hint of irony. He might as well have been describing a weather pattern or a machine malfunction. Judge Benton tilted his head slightly, hands clasped before him, watching. He didn't interrupt. Not yet. The defense attorney took over, feeding Lorne the script. "And Officer Lorne, is this takedown maneuver part of your training?" "Absolutely," Lorne nodded. We are trained to respond to perceived threats using what is called professional reflex. It's about ensuring control of the situation before it escalates. There it was. The phrase that had already begun to circulate across the country like a virus. Professional reflex. 2 words designed to flatten moral complexity. 2 words meant to justify force without consequence. But Judge Benton didn't blink. He let the word sit in the air. Let the crowd hear it, absorb it, question it. The prosecution resumed, changing gears. What, in your opinion, was threatening about Deshaun Ellis? Lorne didn't hesitate. It's not always what they do. It's how they look, the angle of the jaw, the stiffness of the shoulders. Silence can be threatening when paired with a non-cooperative stance. He didn't respond to my commands. You mean, the prosecutor clarified, he stood still and looked at you. Lorne didn't flinch. Correct. It should have sounded absurd. A grown man describing eye contact as a threat. But his voice didn't waver. He believed it, or had convinced himself to. After all, how many times had he said those same words before? How many times had they worked? Did Deshaun raise his hands? Step toward you? Make a verbal threat? No, Lorne said, and then added, but that's not always required for a threat to be credible. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Benton tapped the gavel once, not to scold, but to reset the temperature of the room. Then he leaned forward. Officer Lorne, Benton began, his voice calm but lined with something steelier than before. You've used the term professional reflex 5 times so far. Define it for this court. Lorne seemed briefly taken aback. It's our conditioned response, what we are trained to do without hesitation when we perceive risk. Perceived by whom? Benton asked. Lorne paused. By the officer, Your Honor. So perception becomes justification, Benton pressed. That's how we're trained. You don't wait to confirm a threat. You neutralize it. The room quieted again, but not from awe, from discomfort, from the realization that somewhere along the way, the law had become a stage for fear masquerading as discipline. And in that training, Benton continued, are you instructed to differentiate between resistance and fear? Lorne blinked. If someone's not complying, we can't assume fear. But you can assume aggression. Lorne stiffened. We assume risk. We mitigate. The judge let the word mitigate hang in the air. He let it land in the mind of every juror, every reporter, every citizen who had ever been told to just comply, and everything would be fine. Then he asked one final question. Tell me, officer, when a child stands still and says nothing, is that always a cue to strike? Lorne's jaw tightened. It depends. No, Benton said flatly. It doesn't. Not anymore. For the first time since taking the stand, Lorne looked uncertain. Not because of the law, but because the room no longer bent around his words. The shield he had relied on, rank, language, protocol, was cracking. Each word he uttered no longer reassured. They revealed. Not strength, but blindness. Not clarity, but control disguised as necessity. Outside, more than 1,000 people stood in quiet protest. They didn't chant. They held signs with quotes from the hearing. Professional reflex is not an excuse. Fear does not equal guilt. Stillness is not resistance. Inside the courthouse, Naomi Chen live-tweeted every exchange, her thread reaching over 1 million views by noon. Ethan Lorne's face, once seen shaking hands with governors and police chiefs, now appeared beside hashtags like #takedown culture and #reflex reckoning. But inside the courtroom, the only hashtag that mattered was truth. When the cross-examination ended, Lorne stepped down. His confident stride had softened. His eyes briefly searched the gallery, maybe for support, maybe for explanation. But the crowd looked back with one unified message. "We see you now." Judge Benton recessed the court 15 minutes later. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The day had already spoken louder than any verdict. As the room emptied, Deshawn's mother reached out and touched her son's shoulder, not to console, but to steady herself. Naomi Chen closed her notebook and whispered to a nearby journalist, "We just watched a wall start to crumble. And Ethan Lorne?" He walked out without speaking. His badge no longer gleamed, his boots no longer thundered. Because when the enforcer becomes the one on trial, words like reflex don't shield. They expose. And this time, Judge Benton wasn't listening for defense. He was listening for truth. And in every hollow phrase, every sterile excuse, he found exactly what he needed. Not to punish, but to dismantle. The truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, buried in the margins of paperwork, hidden between redacted lines, coded into the rhythms of reports written by those who assumed no one would ever question them. That was exactly what Judge Isaiah Benton discovered in the days after Officer Ethan Lorne stepped down from the witness stand. He didn't order an inquiry with fanfare. He didn't make a speech. He simply stayed late, past 9 o'clock each night, in his chambers under the glow of a desk lamp with a battered manila folder and a legal pad nearly full of handwritten notes. Because something about Lorne's testimony didn't sit right. Not just the words, but the way they were delivered. Too smooth, too sterile, too familiar. Judge Benton had seen that script before. 3 closed cases were pulled from the archives by a court clerk at his request. Cases from the past 6 years, each involving Officer Lorne. They hadn't been flagged initially. No headlines, no major public outcry. Just routine filings, categorized under minor disturbances, disorderly conduct, obstruction of justice. But once Benton began to read, the repetition became deafening. Case 1. Daryl Keene, 17 years old, stopped outside a library for furtive movement and refusal to make eye contact. Body cam footage was listed as unavailable due to battery malfunction. Officer Lorne's report described Daryl as agitated and verbally combative, though 2 witnesses said he hadn't spoken a word. Charges were later dropped. Case sealed. No formal complaint filed. Case 2, Miguel Sandoval, 16, tackled during a curfew check. Report cited noncompliant stance. Lorne claimed Miguel had reached toward his waistband. No weapon found. Body cam was active, but the footage was corrupted. No technician could recover it. Miguel walked with a limp for 2 months after. His family filed a complaint. It was dismissed within 2 weeks for lack of evidence. Case 3. Jalen Carter, 15, stopped outside his school. No crime reported, just suspicious behavior. Lorne's report claimed Jalen lingered outside the fence too long. Jalen was shoved to the ground and held until backup arrived. His backpack was emptied onto the pavement. Nothing illegal was found. His mother requested a review. The file was marked resolved and buried under administrative handling. 3 different boys, 3 different neighborhoods, 3 different years. 1 officer, 1 pattern. Benton underlined a phrase that showed up in all 3 reports. The subject refused to comply with repeated verbal instructions. It was the same language Lorne had used in Deshawn Ellis's case. The same language polished over time, insulated by uniforms and badges and procedural terminology that had been designed not to describe reality, but to replace it. He kept reading. Each file had the same quirks, the same vague citations of perceived threat, the same reliance on officer perception over concrete action, the same mysteriously missing or corrupted body cam footage, And none of these cases had gone to trial. They'd been quietly dismissed, archived, and forgotten. Until now. Benton called in Naomi Chen, the journalist who had been covering the Lorne hearings with tireless precision. In the privacy of his chambers, he handed her photocopies of the 3 reports. "These were meant to disappear," he said, "but I want you to see what happens when they're placed side by side." Naomi studied them silently, her eyes narrowing. She recognized the signs. She'd written about similar tactics before, in different cities, under different names. But what made these reports so disturbing was how clean they looked. No smudges, no blood. Just language weaponized into bureaucratic armor. She asked Benton if he would go public. "Not yet," he said. "The courtroom will speak first." Outside, the protests hadn't stopped. Now they carried names. Daryl, Miguel, Jalen. Students painted murals on the side of the courthouse. Artists sketched portraits on cardboard signs. And though many had never heard of these boys before, their stories now echoed through a crowd that understood all too well what it meant to be erased while standing in plain sight. Benton ordered a full internal review of every case Officer Lorne had touched in the last 10 years. The request alone sent tremors through the Briarfield law enforcement network. Quiet meetings were held behind closed doors. Commanders whispered about overreach. Emails circulated urging unity. But it was too late. The curtain had already begun to fall. Each reopened file became a brushstroke in a portrait no one wanted to see. One of institutional neglect, painted with procedural ink. Lorne hadn't acted alone, not entirely. His reports had passed through the hands of supervisors, district attorneys, intake officers, and clerks. And every time, no one stopped him. No one asked why a 15-year-old boy had been cuffed for looking still. No one questioned the phrase furtive movement when it was used like punctuation across a decade's worth of youth encounters. Now they had to. Benton called a special session, not for verdicts, but for testimony. Witnesses from the old cases stepped forward. Daryl Keene, now a college freshman, sat across from Lorne and described how being labeled hostile at 17 cost him a scholarship. Miguel Sandoval limped into the courtroom and described waking up in handcuffs in the ER. Jalen Carter, still in high school, simply said, "I didn't know standing outside my school could get me thrown against a wall." Lorne sat silently through it all. No longer a figure of dominance, now just a man surrounded by the wreckage his Reflex had left behind. Benton asked one question during the hearing, directed not at Lorne, but at the room itself. How many times must a pattern repeat before we stop calling it coincidence? There was no answer, only the sound of pens scratching paper. Naomi's live report reached nearly 2 million views by midnight. Activists across the country reposted the files Benton had unsealed. And in a classroom 3 states away, a teacher showed her students the mural of Jalen Carter's face, painted under the words, "We were always visible. You just didn't look." The review expanded. Federal oversight was proposed. Internal Affairs, once silent, began sending requests for subpoenas. But Judge Benton remained still at the center of it all. Not shouting, not celebrating, just steady. Because to him, this wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. And as he flipped through one more file stamped "Case Closed," he wrote in the margin, "Truth doesn't stay buried. It waits." Naomi Chen had covered stories that tore cities apart, and others that tried to stitch them back together. She'd stood outside burning precincts, walked through rallies at midnight, and written words that made bureaucrats squirm. But nothing had prepared her for the moment Judge Isaiah Benton handed her the 3 case files, Daryl Keene, Miguel Sandoval, and Jalen Carter, spanning nearly a decade of quiet brutality at the hands of Officer Ethan Lorne. She didn't flinch when she saw the names. She'd seen too many like them before. What made her breath catch, what made her fingers tighten around the paper, was the language, the phrases, the cadence. It was the same as her own, buried in her memory like a splinter under skin. Naomi had been 16 when Lorne stopped her. She had been walking home from track practice, still in her school-issued windbreaker, earbuds in, backpack bouncing against her spine. It was late October. The sidewalks were damp. Leaves clung to her sneakers. She hadn't noticed the cruiser at first. It slid beside her silently, like a shadow, until the spotlight hit her back. She froze, pulled one earbud out, didn't run, didn't speak. She'd been taught what to do, but it hadn't mattered. The door slammed. Heavy boots scraped pavement. Lorne's voice barked from behind, low and tight. "Hands out! Eyes down!" She remembered how the air felt colder suddenly, how her breath came faster. She remembered obeying, but still being shoved against a chain-link fence, her phone falling from her pocket and skittering into the gutter. She remembered the search, swift, clinical, humiliating. She remembered the word suspicious written in the citation that never made it to court, and how her parents told her not to make noise about it. "It's over," her mother had whispered. "Let it stay that way." But it hadn't stayed. It lived in her bones, in every story she chased, in every question she asked. That night on the sidewalk had never ended. It had just waited. Now, with Benton's files spread before her, Naomi saw the blueprint. The same phrases used like ritual incantations: furtive movement, noncompliant stance, perceived threat. They weren't just words, they were shields. Woven into reports, these terms sterilized abuse, obscured intent, and gave men like Lorne a way to act without consequence. She read through the cases again, each one more maddening than the last. Footage gone, testimony buried, internal reviews rubber-stamped and forgotten. But the real story, the rot, lurked behind the ink. Naomi didn't wait for permission. She started digging. She called in favors, reached out to former colleagues, ex-officers, anyone who'd ever worked near or around the State Public Safety Bureau. One retired technician remembered seeing dozens of Lorne's body cam files marked irretrievable before ever being checked. Another whistleblower admitted that some officers were trained to tilt their cameras mid-engagement, obscuring the view with their own torsos. She found emails, encrypted, auto-deleted, showing that complaints were routinely rerouted to a legal department that specialized in suppressing liability rather than investigating misconduct. The deeper she went, the clearer it became. Lorne was not a rogue actor. He was a product of design. Her reporting began as a thread. A single article posted just after the special session Judge Benton convened. She called it the pattern they tried to erase. In it, she laid out the 3 reopened cases and included segments of transcripts, witness photos, and charts comparing use of force language across Lorne's reports. She didn't editorialize, she let the data speak. Within 24 hours, the article had over 300,000 shares. Teachers printed it for classroom discussion. Organizers chanted its title at City Hall. Victims started reaching out, not just in Briarfield, but across the state. Some were anonymous. Others left full names and dates, willing to testify if the time ever came. The thread widened. She traced funding lines from the State Public Safety Bureau to a shadowy consultancy group known only by its acronym, MARS, Municipal Adaptive Response Strategies. The group billed itself as a risk mitigation agency that trained officers in tactical response and courtroom language. Their presentations included slides like commanding optics and narrative construction under review. Lorne had been one of their earliest participants. So had his supervisor. So had Captain Vincent Rourke, the man now whispered about in hushed tones inside department halls as the one who had engineered the doctrine of reflex. Naomi didn't just uncover connections. She revealed an ecosystem, one that rewarded men for turning instincts into procedure and prejudice into protocol. Her editor warned her to slow down. "You're getting into dangerous waters," he said. "You're accusing systems, not just men." But Naomi couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she saw how many names had been tucked into dusty boxes and dismissed with language that looked clean on paper but stank of complicity. She called it the polish of injustice, how institutional cruelty hides under professional terms, how it files its edges until they're just sharp enough to hurt, but dull enough not to scream. And then came the night Naomi received a package. No return address. Just a padded envelope left on the hood of her car outside the courthouse. Inside, a thumb drive, a single folder, labeled Doctrine Archives. She opened it in the newsroom basement, hands shaking. Dozens of documents, training modules, internal memos. One presentation titled De-escalation through dominance outlined how posture, tone, and body language should be interpreted as pre-incident indicators, effectively turning stillness, silence, and eye contact into probable cause. Another slide read, "Control is perception. Whoever frames the moment first wins the courtroom." She called Judge Benton that night, met him in chambers after hours, showed him the drive. He didn't speak for a long time after reading. He just sat back, hands folded, and whispered, "We're not fighting bad apples. We're dismantling the orchard." The next morning, Naomi's report went live. It was 10,000 words, titled simply, "The Doctrine of Reflex." It linked cases, named names, cited sources. The article broke the site's servers twice. Civil rights attorneys began drafting suits. Federal review panels convened emergency sessions. Protesters added a new chant to their march. Reflex is a cover word. But Naomi wasn't done. Because the most important part wasn't what was revealed. It was who remembered. Her own story, once buried beneath fear and silence, now stood beside the others, not louder, but louder together. She realized that memory wasn't weakness. It was evidence, the kind they couldn't redact, couldn't erase. And in the growing noise of a nation starting to listen, Naomi Chen's voice became the one that refused to forget. Before the protests, before the files, before the kick that cracked a courtroom into history, there was a name that lingered in hallway whispers and unsigned memos, never spoken too loudly, but always with a peculiar weight. Captain Vincent Rourke. In Naomi Chen's reporting, his name had appeared only once, buried in the metadata of a training module titled Command Thresholds and Threat Recognition. But the more she uncovered, the more that single mention began to pulse beneath everything. Every phrase Lorne used on the stand, every blank-eyed justification in the files Judge Benton had reopened, every sanitized report that turned a teenager into a threatening silhouette, they all led back to Rourke. He had never appeared in court. He had never touched a single arrest record. But his fingerprints were everywhere. Rourke wasn't a man easily found in the public eye. There were no grand speeches on record, no flashy interviews, no trail of sound bites to dissect. He avoided spotlights like they were poison. But behind the scenes, deep within the City Law Enforcement Training Division, he was legend. Some called him the philosopher cop. Others whispered he was the real chief of the department, regardless of title. His word, it was said, could shape policy faster than any vote. He didn't wear stars on his shoulder. He wore them in the minds of those he trained. and for over 15 years, Rourke had been the invisible architect of a doctrine that transformed suspicion into reflex, and reflex into law. Naomi's drive, the one left anonymously on her car, cracked him open like a sealed vault. At first, she didn't know what she was looking at. PowerPoints, internal memos, lesson outlines, feedback forms. But then she found it, an audio file, buried inside a folder labeled Legacy. It was from a closed-door instructor summit held 7 years prior, meant only for elite field commanders and tactical supervisors. The file was scratchy, likely recorded without permission, but the voice was unmistakable. Calm, calculated, almost soothing in its certainty. It belonged to Rourke. "What we teach is not aggression," he said, his tone quiet but commanding. "It's anticipation. You don't wait for the swing to know it's coming. You read the jaw, the stance, the stillness. Posture is predictive. Movement is a lie. Silence is resistance. If they freeze, it's because they're choosing their moment." He spoke as if fear were a science, as if threat could be divined not from action, but from interpretation, as if every citizen were a probability algorithm in need of suppression. And worse, he framed it as protection, as a gift officers gave to themselves and to the public. A clean incident, he called it, quick, coded, defensible. Naomi had to pause the tape halfway through, not from shock, but from nausea. In follow-up documents, she found course descriptions that read like military intelligence briefings, subtextual compliance recognition, optic command and response calibration, reflexive suppression protocols. These weren't just buzzwords, they were doctrine, standard-issue curriculum for every precinct captain and unit leader under Rourke's reach. Officers were graded on how quickly they could respond to ambiguous escalation, how fluidly they could document an incident to minimize liability. There were even simulations, rooms built to replicate common encounter scenarios, with actors paid to represent non-compliant figures. Naomi tracked down one of the actors. He quit after 3 weeks, said the officers weren't being trained to defuse. They were being taught to dominate without hesitation. Judge Benton read Naomi's findings with a grim steadiness. The pieces were falling into place faster than the city could prepare. Every courtroom revelation was now a direct indictment of the system that Rourke had spent a career designing. But Benton wasn't surprised. He'd seen men like Rourke before, not on the stand, but in the shadows behind it. Not in uniforms, but in philosophies. Men who didn't need to shout, because their doctrine did the speaking for them. He summoned Rourke, not with a subpoena, not yet, but with a formal request for voluntary testimony. It was procedural, courteous, but it was also a warning, and Rourke declined, cited administrative obligations, scheduling conflicts, legal reviews. Benton didn't press, not immediately, because he knew that men who believe they are above consequence rarely hide. They just wait for the noise to die down. But this time, the noise only grew louder. Naomi published her exposé, The Invisible Architect, 5 days later. It was longer than her previous work, more surgical, less rage, more precision. She laid out the full scope of Rourke's influence, from officer training manuals to language used in state-sponsored law enforcement seminars. She connected the dots between Lorne and over 20 officers who had attended Rourke's programs and were later investigated for use of force complaints. She released the audio. She published internal documents showing Rourke had once advised precinct commanders to prepare for perception fallout, and suggested that officers plant their narrative first. The story went national. Panels debated the ethics of training perception as truth. Senators called for a statewide audit of all field instruction materials. Former trainees began speaking anonymously, some in guilt, some in defense. "He made us feel like gods," one said, "like we were the last line before chaos." But others, like Officer Janice Merrill, one of the few women in Lorne's old precinct, publicly denounced the doctrine. "It wasn't about safety," she told Naomi. "It was about control." Outside the courthouse, new signs appeared. Rourke trained him. "Power is not proof. We refuse to be interpreted." Graffiti artists began stenciling Rourke's name beside a silhouette of a raised baton. His name was no longer a whisper. It was a reckoning. Still, Rourke remained quiet. No press statements, no television interviews, no op-eds, just silence. A calculated retreat from the fire he had sparked. But Naomi knew better. Silence wasn't surrender. It was resistance. The same kind he had taught. The kind that waits. But Judge Benton didn't wait. Within 72 hours, he signed an official judicial order requesting all training documentation created under Rourke's supervision for the last 12 years. He invoked public interest doctrine. He cited Naomi's reporting as evidence of urgent concern. The state's legal apparatus scrambled to stall. Lawyers filed injunctions. Departments pleaded for time. But time was the one thing the public no longer had patience for. The doctrine was falling. Not from a single strike, but from accumulation. 1,000 cuts from 1,000 truths. From Benton's questions, from Deshawn's stillness, from Naomi's words, from every file that refused to stay buried, and from the realization that the most dangerous weapons were not batons or bullets, but ideas. Ideas taught, replicated, internalized. Ideas planted like seeds in the minds of those sworn to protect, until they bloomed into rituals of dominance and denial. And at the center of it all was Vincent Rourke, a man who trained others to see threat in reflection, to strike before understanding, and to never ever question what they were taught to fear. But now, for the first time, fear belonged to him. It was a Wednesday morning, just past 10, when Tyrese Daniels took the stand. The air in Briarfield Superior Courtroom No. 3 felt heavier than usual, as though the past 2 weeks of revelations, Naomi Chen's unflinching reports, Judge Benton's relentless inquiries, and the uncovering of Captain Vincent Rourke's Reflex doctrine had thickened the very walls. Every bench in the gallery was filled. Journalists with notepads, students with signs folded in their laps, mothers who had marched every night since that kick, and fathers who had said nothing because they had learned silence was safer. Outside, the crowd had grown past the courthouse steps and spilled into the street. No chants today, just quiet. The kind of quiet that waits for something to break. Tyrese didn't look like a fire starter. He was 23 now, tall and narrow, with a loose brown suit that didn't quite fit at the shoulders and a tie that looked like it had been knotted too many times. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the witness chair. Each step seemed to carry more than just weight. It carried memory. Buried ones. Ones he had tried to forget. But Judge Benton had reopened the case. The file had been sealed for 5 years, stamped resolved, and forgotten by everyone but Tyrese. He sat, adjusted the mic, cleared his throat. Benton gave a nod, the kind that said, "Take your time. We're not looking away." Tyrese began with a date. February 3rd, 2020. A night he could never erase. He was just 18 then, fresh out of high school, on his way to his cousin's apartment with a backpack full of textbooks and a grocery bag with 2 cans of chicken soup. He hadn't made it halfway down 9th Street before the cruiser rolled up behind him. He didn't know the officer's name at the time. Only remembered the spotlight, the shout, the way his feet froze mid-step. He didn't run, he didn't reach. He turned around slowly and said, "I'm just trying to get home." Then came the command, "On the ground, now." Tyrese's voice cracked slightly as he recounted it. "I didn't know what I'd done wrong," he said. "I asked why. He said I matched a description." He glanced toward the defense table. Ethan Lorne sat there, motionless, face fixed in a performance of calm. "I said I didn't want no trouble, but when I didn't drop fast enough, when I hesitated, he pushed me. Hard. My face hit the sidewalk. I could taste blood." A rustle passed through the gallery. "Not outrage. Recognition. We've heard this before," someone would later write. "We just didn't listen." Judge Benton remained still. He didn't blink. Naomi Chen scribbled notes at the front bench, jaw clenched, her pen carving through the page like a blade. She knew this story already. She had heard echoes of it in every other victim. But something about hearing it in Tyrese's own voice, raw, uncertain, but unwilling to flinch, made it hit differently. It wasn't just testimony. It was a reckoning. Tyrese continued. "He kept asking why I was nervous. I told him it was because I'd never been arrested. He told me, 'Then maybe it's time.'" His eyes glistened but didn't spill over. I tried to explain. He wouldn't listen. I ended up spending the night in holding. Got charged with obstruction. They dropped it later, but the arrest stayed on my record. I lost my job at the library. Couldn't even apply for a city scholarship after that. One night. One reflex. Flex. "Do you remember what he wrote in the report?" Benton asked, his voice quiet. Tyrese nodded. "Yeah. Said I showed signs of pre-resistance behavior. Said I tensed my jaw and took an aggressive half-step. I didn't even know what that meant. I was standing still." The phrase landed hard. Pre-resistance behavior. The very language Rourke had enshrined. The very phrase Naomi had highlighted in bright red in her now viral exposé. In courtroom after courtroom, officers had used it to frame stillness as threat, hesitation as defiance, posture as rebellion. And for the first time, the people in that room saw the actual cost. Not theoretical, not procedural, but human. Flesh and breath and future. A juror wiped their eye. Tyrese paused, looked at Lorne, looked back at Benton. "I'm not here to get revenge," he said. "I'm here because I need people to understand. It's not just one bad officer. It's how they're taught to see us. How standing still becomes resisting. How silence becomes guilt. How we end up carrying records heavier than the backpacks we had on our shoulders when they stopped us." He drew a slow breath. "And I know I'm not the only one." That was when the dam broke. From the back of the courtroom, another voice spoke. Quiet. "Me too." Heads turned. A young man stood up. No one had noticed him before. His name was Marcus Riley. Another name from another sealed file. He nodded once, then sat. Then another, "Me too." And another, "He got me outside the mall. Said I looked wrong." The room didn't erupt. It rose. Slowly. Like truth, finally finding space to breathe. Benton let it happen. Didn't strike the gavel. Didn't call for order. Because what he saw wasn't disorder. It was revelation. The judge leaned forward, his voice just above a whisper. "Let the record show the witness is not alone." Lorne's face hardened. For a moment, he opened his mouth, perhaps to refute, to correct, to reclaim control. But the courtroom no longer bent to his presence. The architecture of fear, once crafted so carefully by doctrine and training, had started to buckle under the weight of lived memory. He said nothing. Outside, the crowd began to stir again. Not in chaos, but in echo. People passed around quotes from the hearing. "Stillness is not resistance. I didn't even know what that meant. Let the record show. Hashtags merged into one. Where the record? That night, Naomi published Tyrese's full testimony, verbatim. No embellishments, no commentary, just his words. It was the most shared article she had ever written. Not because it broke new facts, but because it told the truth plainly. And people finally listened. And Tyrese? He stepped down from the stand without applause, without cameras in his face. But as he passed the rows of onlookers, people stood. Quietly. Some nodded. Some reached out a hand. Some just met his gaze and held it. Because in that one moment, in that one voice, shaking but unbowed, the courtroom had shifted, and there would be no going back. By the time the courtroom emptied after Tyrese Daniels's testimony, something unspoken had settled over Briarfield. Not victory, not closure, but gravity. Like the earth had tilted a few degrees under the weight of a truth too long denied. There were no cheers, no fireworks, no triumphant music swelling in the background. Just the echo of one young man's trembling voice cutting through a silence that had lasted for years. It wasn't a climax. It was a turning. And Judge Isaiah Benton, sitting behind the bench with his gavel idle and his notes scattered like fallen leaves, understood better than anyone what came next. The reckoning. It began not with fanfare, but with paperwork. At 8 o'clock the following morning, before the courthouse opened, before the protesters reassembled, before the first keystroke of Naomi Chen's next report, Benton was already at his desk. He wore no robe yet, only a simple gray shirt with sleeves rolled up, ink smudged along the edge of his hand as he drafted the judicial order that would shake the very walls of the Briarfield justice system. It was 6 pages long, written with the kind of precision that couldn't be dismissed or diluted. The language was careful, but uncompromising. A full departmental inquiry into Officer Ethan Lorne's conduct over the past 10 years. A suspension effective immediately. A recommendation for federal oversight over all use of force investigations involving minors within the city's jurisdiction, and the unsealing of 53 case files previously marked confidential. He signed it with a pen that had belonged to his father, a lawyer who never lived to see a courtroom like this, but who had once told his son, "Justice doesn't make noise, it makes history." Benton didn't smile as he handed the signed order to the clerk. He didn't pose for cameras. He just said, "File it. Deliver it. Today." The ripple was instant. Lorne was escorted from the courthouse that afternoon. Not in handcuffs. Benton had insisted on dignity, even for those who had failed to offer it. But the message was unmistakable. The officer who once swaggered into courtrooms and walked free from scrutiny was now the subject of it. When the press reached out for comment, Lorne's attorney said only, "We disagree with the court's interpretation." But interpretation had nothing to do with it anymore. This was about fact, about pattern, about harm etched so deep into the system it had started to look like the wood grain of the courthouse itself. Outside, crowds watched quietly as Lorne left the building. No jeers, no shouts, just a sea of eyes, some furious, some relieved, most just tired. Tired of waiting for a moment like this, tired of stories like Tyrese's, Deshawn's, Miguel's, Jalen's, Daryl's. Tired of the word misconduct being used like a seatbelt to restrain outrage. They didn't cheer. They bore witness. Back inside, Naomi Chen stood in the hallway near the press box, staring at the bulletin board where the court's official order had just been pinned. She didn't pull out her phone right away, didn't tweet. She just stood there, letting the words wash over her. This court does not accept fear as justification. She had heard that line before, in Benton's ruling from Deshawn's trial. But now, it wasn't a soundbite. It was policy. The following day, The governor's office issued a statement praising Benton's courage and leadership. Then came the call, an invitation to accept nomination to the state's highest bench, the Supreme Court of the Commonwealth. It was a seat that had opened just the week before. The political timing was too clean to ignore. A promotion disguised as a reward. A way to honor the judge who had brought a crooked department to its knees and remove him from the front lines in the same breath. Benton read the letter in silence, folded it once, then again, then placed it gently in the drawer beneath his desk, beside the gavel he rarely used. Later that afternoon, when the nomination was made public and reporters rushed into the courtroom for comment, Benton stood and addressed them directly. "I am honored by the confidence the state has placed in me," he said, "but I decline the nomination." The room froze. Cameras stopped clicking. Someone gasped. "I've been asked to take a higher seat," he continued, "but I believe the highest bench is not measured by its altitude, but by its proximity to the people who come here seeking something more than rulings. They come seeking repair." There was no thunderous applause, no standing ovation, just the stunned quiet of a room trying to make sense of a man choosing the trenches over the throne. But Benton didn't need applause. He needed time, and leverage, and clarity. The kind of clarity that could only be found in the trial courtrooms where boys like Deshaun and Tyrese had first been named defendants instead of victims, where language had been used like camouflage, where authority had been mistaken for truth. He returned to chambers that night as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The court's walls felt different, less like barriers, more like beacons. Files that had sat untouched for years were now being reopened. The legal staff, once weary and cynical, moved with a new urgency, a new purpose. Prosecutors reconsidered plea deals. Public defenders revisited dismissed complaints. Clerks stayed late. In the days that followed, Benton worked quietly, methodically. He formed a small review panel, brought in outside experts, requested community observers for future hearings involving law enforcement. He didn't make grand speeches. He didn't ask for monuments. But every step he took echoed louder than the last. And in a coffee shop just across the street, Naomi Chen drafted her next story. Not about Lorne or Rourke, but about Benton. She titled it, "The Judge Who Stayed." In it, she wrote, "Some men climb higher so they can look down. Others stay low so they can lift others up. Benton chose the dirt, the sweat, the grief. He chose the room where truth trembles before it stands. And because he stayed, so will the reckoning." At sunset on the courthouse steps, someone placed a small candle beneath the plaque that now bore the names of the boys whose cases had sparked it all. Not an official plaque, just cardboard. Handwritten, but real. No cameras were there to capture it. No headlines followed. But someone whispered, "He didn't leave us." And someone else answered, "Then we won't leave either." And so, the courtroom stayed lit, not by flashbulbs, but by the quiet, steady fire of a man who refused to rise above justice because he knew real justice never looks down. It looks us in the eye and refuses to blink. It stood in the plaza, just beyond the courthouse steps, where the bricks still remembered the weight of protest, and the air still held the ghost of every name once chanted in defiance. The sculpture arrived quietly, without ceremony or cutting of ribbons. No mayor spoke, no cameras flashed. It appeared one morning as the fog lifted over Briarfield, catching early light on the surface of something new, something enduring. It was not a figure or a face, not a statue of a judge or a boy or a movement's leader. It was an open palm, 5 fingers spread wide, reaching forward but not clutching, not striking. Just open, waiting, steady. People paused when they saw it. Some thought it a gesture of peace. Others saw warning. Some saw surrender. But those who had stood on the courthouse steps day after day, who had walked out of classrooms holding signs, who had filed back into courtrooms to hear stories that sounded like their own, they knew. It wasn't surrender. It was resistance in its purest, most deliberate form. Refusal. Refusal to be erased. Refusal to be bent. Refusal to look away. Below the hand, on a plaque no bigger than a school binder, were words carved not in brass, but in stone. Some don't resist with fists. They resist by refusing to fall. There were no names, no dedications, no list of the fallen or the spared. Because it wasn't just for the few whose stories had made it into the record, it was for the many who hadn't. It was for Deshaun Ellis, whose stillness had been mistaken for defiance. For Tyrese Daniels, who spoke when he was never supposed to. For Daryl, Miguel, Jalen. For Naomi Chen, who turned memory into evidence. For the mothers who waited in pews. For the fathers who stayed silent, because they had been taught silence was survival. It was for the living and the watching. In the weeks after Judge Benton declined the nomination to the state's highest bench, choosing instead to remain in his modest courtroom, the city changed, but not in the way the headlines had promised. There were no sweeping reforms overnight, no miracle legislation, no magical end to misconduct or bias. What there was, what lingered, was something slower, deeper, more powerful. Accountability, without applause. Benton's courtroom became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not for spectacle, but for example. Law students sat in the back rows, not to chase ambition, but to study dignity. Clerks began their shifts with the gravity of people who now understood the weight of a misplaced word. A dismissed file. A signature scribbled too quickly. Cases once swept aside were reviewed again. Not all ended differently, but all were seen. And the sculpture, that palm of stone, became a meeting place. Protesters no longer needed bullhorns to gather. Survivors brought candles and tucked their court documents underneath the base at night, a silent offering. Children pressed their own hands against the cold fingers, measuring the distance between fear and faith. Naomi wrote about it in her final article for the Briarfield Ledger, a piece she called "The Hand That Never Closed." She wrote, "It does not point, it does not strike, it does not wave, it simply remains, and in remaining, it dares us to do the same." Rourke's name faded from the papers, but his doctrine did not. Not yet. Policy review boards took shape. Training manuals were revised. But Benton knew, as did Naomi, as did every boy who had once been told to lower his gaze, that systems do not fall with one blow. They unravel, thread by thread, hearing by hearing, one case at a time, one refusal to look away at a time. In a rare interview months later, when asked why he had turned down the highest bench in the state, Benton answered simply, "Because I've learned the closer you are to the ground, the better you can hear what's been ignored." That quote, too, made it onto protest signs, classroom bulletin boards, and even etched along the base of the sculpture by someone in the middle of the night. No one claimed it, but no one painted over it either. That was how change took hold in Briarfield, not by decree, but by witness. Tyrese returned to that courthouse once, nearly a year after he testified. He didn't go inside, just stood near the sculpture, hands in his pockets, watching a group of students gather around it with notebooks and wide eyes. One of them asked him if he knew who it was for. He looked at the hand, then at them. "It's for anyone who's ever been told not to speak up," he said. Or worse, told that speaking wouldn't matter. He didn't stay long, just enough to touch the stone, run his fingers along the edge of that open palm, and leave behind a folded note he tucked underneath its base. Later, Naomi would find it while walking home one evening, her bag heavy with files from a new case, another boy, another phrase in another report that sounded too familiar. She knelt to pick up the note. It was scribbled in hurried, careful handwriting. I stood still because I was scared. I speak now because I'm not alone. No signature, just that. She placed it in her notebook and kept walking. And the sculpture remained. No calendar marked its unveiling. No clock told the hour of its birth. But those who passed it knew what it meant. That justice isn't always a gavel strike or a televised verdict. Sometimes it's a whisper that refuses to fade. A silence that cannot be interpreted as consent. A stone hand that doesn't demand praise, but refuses to close. Justice, Benton had once told his clerks, doesn't always arrive with celebration. It isn't loud. It isn't proud. It doesn't march to applause. It settles. It holds. It watches. And when done right, it endures. So the story didn't end in cheers. It ended in stillness, in an open hand, and a city that, for the first time in a long time, didn't look away. What happened in Briarfield is more than a courtroom drama. It's a mirror held up to the face of America, reflecting what many have long felt, but too few have acknowledged. That justice, when it shows up at all, often arrives quietly, slowly, and only after enough people refuse to look away. The lessons here aren't just for judges or lawyers or journalists. They're for all of us. For every citizen who has ever shrugged and said, "That's just how it is." For every teacher afraid to start the conversation. For every voter who skips the local ballot, not realizing it appoints the very judges and prosecutors who shape these systems. This story is a reminder that silence is a choice. That stillness, when chosen, can be resistance, but when enforced, becomes erasure. It tells us that we cannot rely on individual heroes to fix systemic rot. Judge Benton stayed, yes, but he stayed because the people outside didn't leave. Naomi Chen exposed the doctrine, but it only mattered because readers listened, shared, demanded more. Deshaun stood still and nearly vanished, until others refused to let him disappear. If there's one lesson to carry, it's this. Justice is not passive. It requires presence, engagement, memory. That means speaking out at the school board when biased discipline policies are proposed. That means showing up at city council meetings, not just when tragedy strikes. That means checking the language in police reports and asking why certain kids are always the ones described as noncompliant or aggressive. This story isn't just about what happened in one courtroom. It's a blueprint for what accountability can look like when we all decide enough is enough. And if you've made it this far, if these stories moved you, if you felt the weight of Deshaun's stillness or the fire behind Tyrese's voice, then don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button. Like this video. Share it with someone who still doesn't understand why these moments matter. Because justice doesn't begin with a verdict. It begins with attention, with memory, with a voice. Yours. And the more of us who refuse to look away, the louder that silence becomes, not in noise, but in force, in truth. So subscribe. Stay present. Stay loud. Stay steady. Because justice, like that open hand in Briarfield, endures only if we do.